Hello, everybody. In the wake of the election, a lot of concern and fear about its impact on American education system. There's always been a lot of warnings that if the Republicans came to power, they would use Florida's education model, which seems to be about censoring the past, or at least banning books which disagree with their worldview. The universities are also in America, according to Time at least, scared of a second Trump term. So there'll probably be a lot of people in the universities now who are losing sleep, and many people, not just in universities, but in schools, wonder what the Trump presidency will mean for education. My guest today is not US based. He's based in the UK. Frank Furedi is a much published author, former professor of sociology, has a new book out called The War Against the Past: Why the West Must Fight for Its History. I think it's probably more of a conservative than a progressive book. I'm not sure how Frank feels about Trump and the Republicans. Frank, are you concerned that this war against the past that you write about in your new book is as much a problem on the left or the right? Are you concerned about what some people call the Florida education model in the US? Is it the same as the censors on the left?
I think there's a real symmetry here, almost like a mirror image, where you have a situation where for some time now, the left has called for certain books to be banned. In turn, the right has called for other books to be banned. And there seems to be a kind of a very intolerant spirit prevailing in education in all the sectors, from primary to secondary, all the way to university. So I am concerned about the way in which, instead of engaging with conflicting views and people's sentiments who are on the other side to you, instead of dealing with those issues, the tendency tends to be of shutting it down, canceling it, of hoping that it will go away. And there's very little debate or discussion going on. The idea that there should be a debate between left and right, whatever that means these days, has gone. It just simply does not exist in either side of the Atlantic. And that's something that I'm very much worried about.
You wrote a book in 2018, actually did pretty well, How Fear Works, Culture of Fear in the 21st Century. As I said, your training as a sociologist is as a sociologist. You're a professor of sociology at Kent University for many years. You and I have a good friend in common, Keith Teare, who was, I think, one of your students at some point. What is this culture of fear, Frank? And why does it manifest itself in education, in people wanting to shut other people up and in wanting to ban books, whether it's DeSantis in Florida or perhaps some of the woke crowd when it comes to books they're not comfortable with? Why are people scared of hearing opinions that they don't like, that they don't agree with?
I think that over the last kind of couple of decades, we've kind of moved into a situation where, on the one hand, people seem to think that ideas, views that they disagree with are dangerous somehow, are somehow going to not only offend them, but make them feel bad. You got this idea now that free speech is traumatizing and can have very kind of negative medical consequences. And you'll find that as a result of that, once words are seen not just as a medium of communication, but as a weapon, then increasingly discussion and debate is focused on just how damaging certain words can become. And I think one of the things we're finding is a continuous demand to be insulated from offense, insulated from hurt, insulated from pain, not realizing that actually you and I and everybody else develop our ideas and cultivate our intellect through having to explain ourselves to people who aren't necessarily on our side, who aren't necessarily agreeing with us. And a long time ago, the liberal philosopher J.S. Mill made the point in the 19th century that you don't really understand your own ideas unless you have to argue for them. Because if you just merely repeat what you heard, or merely just say the first thing that comes to your head, you're having to argue for them, it really does become a very superficial sentiment. And I think we're kind of losing that old 19th century liberal commitment to the exchange of views, to the clash of sentiments, understanding its creative dimension.
It's interesting, Frank, that you bring up J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, one of the fathers, and certainly a father, although he wrote extensively about women and feminism. He was a champion of 19th century feminism. Mill was a father of 19th century and classical liberalism. His book on liberty is still one of the great classics, if not the great classic. But at the same time, Mill's day job was at the East India Company, which was essentially a colonial capitalist enterprise. And there are people watching, and you know this better than I do, people who will echo Gandhi's remark about Western civilization, and perhaps this might reflect on Mill, given that Gandhi's experience of Western civilization was as an Indian. He said, someone asked him, what do you think of Western civilization? And Gandhi said, I think it would be a good idea. I'm not sure how true that actually was, but it seems to capture the spirit of the critique of Western civilization. Your book is called Why the West Must Fight for Its History. You bring up Mill's liberalism, but all too often people forget that Mill worked for the East India Company. So it's a rather long-winded question, but how would you respond to that? That when people talk about the West fighting for its history, it's only ever positive, and we're supposed to forget all the bad stuff, which of course Gandhi couldn't, either intellectually or personally.
Well, you know, I always argue don't forget the bad stuff, but also I always argue do not judge people living 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago in accordance with our existing outlook. Because if we do that, then in a sense, what we end up doing is reading history backwards and basically imagining that Mill or anybody else is our peer. So to take a more extreme example, one of the criticisms that often made about the Greek philosophy, and Greek democracy, Athenian democracy, is that Athenian democracy coexisted with slavery. As it happens, slavery was universal, almost entirely universal in the ancient world. So there's nothing special about it. And what people are doing, instead of saying, well, what's unique about Athens was the fact that they discovered democracy and philosophy, which is something that nobody else did. People judge Athens for something that everybody else did, which is that they had slaves. So I think there's a kind of patronizing assumption that we ought to judge people in the past as if they are our peers, and we kind of feel morally superior to someone like Mill or Plato or Aristotle.
Well, I mean, when I say that, I'm not suggesting I feel any moral superiority, but it is important to make the point, isn't it, Frank? Just as it's important to make the point that there was slavery in ancient Athens, and that the books of Aristotle or Plato or even Socrates, in an odd way, were all built upon certain kinds of injustices. I mean, you can still say those things, can't you?
Yeah, you can say that, you know, that there were these things occurred, and any objective historian or thinker will do that. They will try to do a balance sheet and say what was really good, liberating, positive in a particular moment, and what was bad or regressive. That's really the job of historians, to do something like that. But what I'm really suggesting, and this is really why I wrote the book, is that for all the horrible things that have occurred historically in different epochs, nevertheless, people like the Greek philosophers, all the way to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, developed ideas, developed an outlook, which we now use to sensitize ourselves to those injustices. In other words, these people over the centuries created a view of the world, a demand that when people do oppressive, exploitative things, they should be criticized. So to take a very good example is Immanuel Kant, the moral philosopher, who's not criticized because he used racist language now and again, the language of his time. But Immanuel Kant
What did Kant say about what kind of racist language?
I really don't remember exactly. It wasn't like, it was in the late 18th century, and his language was the normal language of the 18th century, where you referred to non-Europeans as being in a way that suggested that they were inferior to Europeans. But at the same time, Immanuel Kant developed a critique of colonialism, argued that colonizing any part of the world is entirely wrong. And he developed a system of ethics, which is used to this day to basically criticize any form of oppression or racism. In fact, his ethical sort of system underpins anti-racism that eventually emerged, and underpins the critique of any form of using people for.
So coming back to Kant, are you saying you talk about, and I'm quoting you here, you have a term in the book, grievance entrepreneurs. When it comes to someone like Kant, are you suggesting that these grievance entrepreneurs want to censor Kant himself so that Kant shouldn't be taught because somehow he's a racist? Or are you saying that the grievance entrepreneurs are obsessed with Kant's racism and somehow ignore his major contribution to Western philosophy, which is substantial? What's the problem?
I think there's several problems. The first problem is that what's happening increasingly is a lot of grievance entrepreneurs suggest that somehow Immanuel Kant is morally inferior to them because of the way that he expressed himself, which I think is weird. When you have such a great individual, such a great thinker, being seen as somehow morally flawed, not understanding the context within which he lived. But more importantly,
so these people are, so to speak, teaching Kant morality.
Exactly, that's why I'm arguing. So, and there are many examples where you take something like a Shakespearean play, and these grievance archaeologists are basically saying we should rewrite Shakespeare's play, make it more racist than it really is, because presumably Shakespeare had some racist ideals that he didn't express. But we know better than Shakespeare what he really thought. And therefore, we're going to rewrite his play like Othello or something else in a language that uses kind of explicitly racist words. Now, that to me is not only arrogant, but the idea that somehow you know better than Shakespeare what he was really thinking at that time assumes that you have this privileged insight into somebody that lived 400 years ago, which, again, is really
and we're
weird.
not even 100% sure that Shakespeare exists. Certainly his work was somehow a reflection of his own age. Why? And it's not just about race. People are very sensitive about Shakespeare, on women and on Jews. Why are people, Frank, so sensitive to using Kant or Shakespeare, men of many centuries ago? Why do people get so outraged if Kant or Shakespeare writes something rather unpleasant about Jews in one of his plays?
I think there's a real impulse towards looking for offense and looking to be offended. And at the same time, what we also have is an attempt to rewrite the past in accordance with our present outlook.
Is it because maybe we're so insecure, really, when we scratch the surface, we're not really that convinced of what we think. So our intellectual insecurity is being taken out on Shakespeare or Kant or somebody else.
But there's a bit of that, but there also is we're trying to almost use the past as this kind of colony, and a temporal.
So we're colonizing the past, Frank. That's a nice way of putting it.
Well, that's what I argued, that we are colonizing the past, because what we're trying to do is to insert ourselves into a world that is very different. Let me give you a very striking example. In archaeology, it's now suggested by activists that it's really, if you find a human remain in ancient Egypt, it's wrong to do a DNA test and say that remain is that of a man or that of a woman. And they argue the reason why it's wrong is because we don't know how they would have identified, what gender they would have identified. Now, the idea that somehow in Cleopatra's time in the pyramids, they were discussing gender politics and kind of identifying as this or that kind of gender, basically is anachronistic. It assumes we're kind of reading history backwards, and we're projecting ourselves into an epoch 4,000 years ago.
So it's an extreme kind of intellectual parochialism. Everything becomes us. We're collapsing the past. Do you think some of it has to do with the fact that history departments are being shut down? When I went to school in England, the history A level was actually very challenging. In some ways, I think it's probably more challenging than many undergraduate or even graduate programs in American universities. And I know in the UK as well, the history as a discipline is in crisis. Is this one of the consequences of this?
A little bit. I think history has adopted a very professional history, has adopted this narcissistic turn as well, to the point at which people now argue that it's okay to be anachronistic. It's okay to, basically to read history backwards, because that's a way of validating yourself and other people in the here and now. So I think what has happened is that professional history has embraced it. So if, for example, you go to Harvard, which is one of the best universities, even now, I suppose, in North America, you look at the history department and its curriculum, you'll find that a disproportionate number of the courses you will take in Harvard would be like queering medieval history or queering ancient.
That's not querying, that's querying. Frank, but hasn't, some people might say, well, yeah, maybe you're right, but this has always been the case. So rather than having querying medieval history these days, 50 years ago, it was Western civilization and the medieval world. Has anything really changed? It's just one group has taken control of our knowledge industry.
Yeah, except it's not really querying, it's queering.
No, I know. I was joking on querying and querying. I got your point.
Anyway, I think what has happened is that a fundamental break has occurred. Throughout human history, people have revised the past. There's nothing wrong with that. People have looked at the past from different perspectives, and they challenged the previous version of events. Nothing really wrong with that. That has really gone on all the time. What's going on now is something very different, which is not rewriting history or revising it, but basically argue that everything that has occurred in the past is morally defective. That everything that's occurred, for example, in the West.
But Frank, aren't you just falling into the same trap that you're critiquing? I mean, you can always find ridiculous examples of people writing their theses on querying this or querying this or that. But the majority of professional, we've done shows on this, the majority of professional historians are still doing their best. And this idea of a fundamental break in history, isn't that absurd? I mean, you're a sophisticated enough sociologist and amateur historian to know that these issues have always been controversial and people have always been arguing about them.
Yeah, like I said, there's always been arguments about it, but what hasn't happened before is, for example, if you take communism, communist historians used to argue that the capitalists were bad, the imperialists were bad, but they would then find heroes like Spartacus, rebelling, really great guy. They would look at the French Revolution. They said these were absolutely great people. You look at these historians today.
But who are they? I mean, you keep on talking about these historians. Aren't you doing exactly what the people...
If you read my book, I name names. And
you can always find names. I take that point. I perused your book before this, but isn't this just your own version of hysteria here?
Well,
and this idea of a fundamental break, I have to admit, I don't buy that.
Well, you don't have to buy it, but if you, there's no reason why you should agree with me. I mean, if you want to be cynical about it, that's fine.
I'm not being cynical. I'm just being honest.
Okay. Well, honest or cynical, it doesn't really matter. The only point I'm making, I'm quite happy to argue about this thing, but all that I know is that in terms of the representation of the past, unless I'm completely missed everything, is one where it's become a story of shame, where everything about America's foundation, Britain's foundation, everything about Europe's history is recast in an entirely negative light. So there's no redeeming features in the way that it might have been the case in previous historical moments. What you now have is an attempt to have a very one-dimensional representation
Right, no, but I take your point. But again, I'm so unconvinced by this. Universities are becoming increasingly irrelevant. These people's papers aren't read. They probably barely read them themselves. Meanwhile, mainstream history is doing very well. The Everything Else is History podcast, I think it's called, is doing incredibly well. I listen to it. It's excellent. Two British historians who do a wonderful job bringing life in a non-ideological sense to the world. So isn't it just that universities, or certain kinds of universities, have been over-professionalized and are irrelevant? But real history, and you go to an airport bookstore, there's still really interesting, thick books on great historical figures that are not written by what you call grievance entrepreneurs.
No, I mean, absolutely right. And what I really write about is not professional history, because professional history has got certain problems, but the problem is much deeper than that. I write about the representation of the past. And most of the representation of the past is not carried out by a professional historian. Most of the representation of the past is the accomplishment of a variety of different cultural entrepreneurs. It's the product of Netflix and various other medium that are in the business of demonstrating what the past kind of looks like. And most important of all, a lot of the representation of the past is the product of activism by non-governmental organizations, by institutions that are devoted towards putting a particular representation forward. And the past is really, what I'm really arguing is that the past has now become a temporal, the distinction between the present and the past, the temporal distinction has gone, in the sense that people treat the past in the same way they would treat the present. And what you end up with is a kind of continuous reading of history backwards, so that what today is just merely seen as the jumping off point to make sense of what has gone on beforehand, rather than actually look at the past within its own terms and try to understand it.
But my sense is that the American election was one where the American voters were asked this question, and they voted for Trump. They voted for, I'm not sure which party you're in, but certainly a lot of Trump supporters would probably agree with your arguments in the war against the past. So most people don't take this absurd position. I mean, you can always find idiots and lunatics, Frank, throughout history. But I take your point. There certainly are some people who have fallen into this trap of nonsense. But is it really the majority? And is it really reshaping a sort of a broad social historical consciousness?
I think it does. So if you look at surveys of young people in Britain and in many other European countries, and ask the question, are you proud to be British, and are you proud to be French, or whatever you are? Increasingly, the majority say they're not. And increasingly, if you ask them questions about the past of their country, they would adopt to this very negative framing of their own origins. And I think that has very important consequences, because if you basically feel ashamed about where you come from, that has got a very important impact on your identity and on your identity formation in terms of who you are and what you're about. So I think that, what the phenomenon I'm describing is widespread and quite pervasive, which doesn't really mean that that everybody buys into it. It merely means that this is becoming the new normal, certainly on educational curriculum.
Right, but in the new normal is always something that people rebel against. I mean, in the last election, people were surprised with how many kids are voting for Trump, how many African Americans, Hispanics are voting for Trump, and they seem to be tired of this. I wonder if the generational quality is interesting. You've written about the idea that childhood is a disease. Is there a generational quality to this? I mean, you're certainly not a child, Frank. You've been around a while. And is this just another version of being disappointed with young people? I mean, you went through it. On the other hand, you were an activist in the 60s. You have your own history of Marxist rebellion. So isn't this just one more version of that we're disappointed with the kids, that they're not living up to our intellectual ideals?
Not really. I mean, I love kids who rebel. I think it's every generation has got to have their rebellion if they are going to mature and develop intellectually and gain intellectual independence. So I'm a big fan of young people challenging society as it is. It's very important for the vitality of humanity for that to occur. What I am worried about is when, and it's not young people who are the problem here, is when, in a sense, young people are treated and engaged with in a therapeutic kind of a way, where from very early age onwards, young people are exposed to a language and to a set of ideals that, instead of tries to strengthen their active side, literally gives them a diagnosis, a psychological diagnosis. If you look at, for example, the way in which America and Britain, mental health problems have become normalized among young people, and the way it's expanding. And this has been going on now for 25, 30 years, decade after decade after decade. The number of kids who are meant to have various diagnostic issues increases. So we're talking about a long-term trend here. And that's not good for young people. That's not good for society. But there seems to be, nevertheless, an obsessiveness on adult world's part to do this.
So you're suggesting that this shift, or this, in your view at least, a descent into therapy, more and more young people in therapy, more and more troubled by all their relationships, divorcing their parents, divorcing their friends, divorcing themselves, that this is this part of this war against the past, that it collapses time. Is that your argument? It personalizes everything, so you're not able to escape from yourself, and everything becomes just a mirror of your own internal therapeutic struggles, or what you perceive as your therapeutic struggle.
I think it's linked to that. I think that, if you suggest that human beings, human accomplishment in the past are all deeply flawed, as if humanity itself, isn't really worth very much, then it's not surprising that instead of providing young people with role models, we provide them with negative models. Some historians have gone so far as to suggest that the really good time in this world was before human beings were on the planet. That was the really good time. After human beings began to inhabit the planet, things are going downwards.
But that's Rousseau, really, isn't it?
Well, Rousseau squared, because Rousseau himself never went as far as that. But now what we got is a situation
Rousseau squared. I like that. Maybe I'll put that as the Frank, you and I are both big fans of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, who have been in perpetual decline. Do you think there's any coincidence with the fact that all this has been happening during our decline? Can we blame everything on Spurs?
Sometimes I do. On a bad day, I say I blame the football team. Otherwise, I would be a much nicer, happier person.
Yeah, I mean, back in 1960, when we won the double and we were the best team in the world, this wasn't the case. Talk a little bit about your own history, Frank. You have, as I said, you're a close friend of Keith Teare. You taught him. Keith is, as you know, an ex-Marxist entrepreneur now in Silicon Valley. I'm not quite sure how he squares that circle. You began life as an emigre from Hungary. A lot of your early life was spent as a revolutionary communist. You were very much involved in the Revolutionary Communist Party. Now you seem a lot more conservative. How would you, if you were a historian, and maybe one day you will write your own memoir, how would you summarize your own life?
Very difficult to be objective about it, because obviously when we look back on our lives, we try to see ourselves in the best possible light, and maybe become a little bit dishonest when we do that. But the way that I see it is, I'm very lucky and very fortunate, because I left Hungary when I was 9 in Stalinist Hungary, and that experience was very formative for me, because I lived in a very difficult circumstance. Came to North America, became a student radical in the 1960s, which was great, because for a brief moment I thought everything was possible. It was one of those great moments when almost all of my friends.
And it was a very useful moment, not just for yourself, but for that whole generation, wasn't it? Everything was possible.
And it really radicalized not just me, but all my peers. and then moved to England to do my PhD. And England at that time was much quieter and much more sedate than North America was. But nevertheless, I thought it was intellectually quite exciting and stimulating. I got involved in politics, left-wing politics, which took up a lot of my time, and I learned a lot through that whole experience. But in this journey, I suppose you kind of find that the world changes around you. And as the world changes around you, you kind of take with you certain things from the past and you leave other things behind. So, people are often surprised when I tell them I'm the same person that I was always, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Now.
So what does that tell us about revolutionary communism? That it's by definition conservative, or does it suggest that being conservative is also, in a sense, being a revolutionary communist? I mean, you and Keith share this, and I know a lot of the other people in your network. I've spoken at your Battle of Ideas conference a couple of times. They're also part of this rather odd intellectual history of sort of weirdly illogical, and yet when you think about it, maybe it's more logical than it seems.
Well, I think everybody's a little bit different, but when I'm often asked when I do interviews in Europe, how do I define myself, which is very difficult because left and right the meaning has changed quite a bit, if it means anything. And I always say that when it comes to certain things like family life, like community solidarity, I'm very conservative about maintaining certain traditions, certain ways of being from the past. When it comes to individual behavior, for example, relationships, I'm very liberal in the sense that I believe that people need to have the choice and live with the consequences of those choices. And I'm a big believer in moral autonomy and all these liberal values. And when it comes to economics, I'm ambivalent because I think that I'm fairly socialist when it comes to things like providing people with resources for education and health. I think that's really quite important that we do that. So when you add it up all together, it's a bit of a mixture of things, but it's something that I've taken from my life and something that is me, but it doesn't really fit into any of the kind of classical political categories.
I wonder how you fit this into the Hungarian experience. When I was an undergraduate, I got taught by George Schoflin at LSE. I'm sure you know him. He went back to Hungary and became a close associate of Orban. We never imagined that of him. You've gone back to Hungary now. You were speaking recently at the Danube Institute. Orban himself, of course, was initially a liberal, seen as a liberal. He was funded and supported by George Soros. Now he's turned dramatically against Soros. He's seen as one of the pioneers of a liberal democracy. Is there something odd, Frank, about that's going on in Hungary? I'm not suggesting that you are Orban or that you're George Schoflin, but there seems to be a lot of men like that who began as liberals, critics of injustice, and have ended up as champions of this new neo-authoritarianism.
Well, I think I would reject the idea that I or Schoflin or even Orban are authoritarian. I think that's the optics.
Well, Orban likes the term, doesn't he?
Not authoritarian. He doesn't like the term.
Well, illiberal. Then he likes. He's embraced the term of illiberalism. And you're the one who speaks highly of liberalism, John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, he embraced the term illiberal democracy, not illiberalism, which is different. Now, I'm not saying that I have the same standpoint on issues as any other of these men you mentioned, but I do think there tends to be a caricatured version of what Hungarians are like. Now, obviously, we have, I suppose, certain cultural sort of ideals that are quite distinct about Hungary to do with the nature of that kind of society. But I don't think that the pattern you're describing is confined to Hungarians. It's widespread throughout Europe. And it's interesting, every time I give a speech or I do a TV interview in Europe, I encounter people who had a very similar journey to me, going through different phases, but then at a certain point drawing consequences which are great variance to where they began. I think that is I call that human development, individual development, that we don't repeat ourselves for the whole of our lives. and we obviously make mistakes along the way, but there's a kind of hopefully a correcting mechanism that we've embraced and internalized.
Frank, one of the problems, in my view at least, with titles of books like yours, The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Fight for Its History, and you know this as well as I do, is that the West itself is used by different people for different reasons. The concept of the West is really just a weapon. And in Hungary, for example, this idea of the West is just a thinly veiled euphemism for hostility towards any kind of immigration, particularly supposedly quote unquote non-Western immigration from North Africa and the Middle East. I'm not suggesting that this is true of you, but is this fair that in Europe, Le Pen, in Italy, in Hungary with Orban, in Poland with the previous government, when anyone ever really talks about the West, what they mean is they want to keep out brown people, they want to keep out Muslims. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, I think that there is a sense in which a lot of governments have realized that it's very difficult to have a multicultural society, in their own confines. It's much easier in the United States or in Canada, but if you look at the way that multiculturalism works, all you got to do is look at Amsterdam earlier this month, where you had essentially anti-Jewish pogroms erupting out of nothing.
Well, you and I are longtime football fans, Frank. We know that this was just a little bit of football violence. No one got killed. I mean, so you're suggesting that this justifies not allowing North Africans into Holland, or not allowing Jews to fly to a game to watch their Israeli team?
No, what it means is that multiculturalism, in the way that it works in certain societies, is necessarily one that leads to the polarization of those societies. If you look at Europe...
So are you saying in your own supposedly tolerant Western civilization kind of way that you support keeping the Muslims out of Hungary or the Netherlands or the United Kingdom?
I'm not saying...
suggesting that multiculturalism is a failed policy?
Well, multiculturalism is a failed policy. I'm not the only one, I think.
Well, I'm not. I think maybe that's subject of your next book. I'm not sure everyone would agree with that.
Anyway, if you look at one in the index of this, the amount of contact that occurs across different cultures, it's you have the ghettoization of Paris, Malmo in Sweden, Amsterdam, Brussels, where essentially people live in their own bubbles and they don't engage with each other. Now, there are some places where multiculturalism can work and has worked, and that's great. So if you go to Toronto or in some parts of the United States, multiculturalism has been relatively successful for a variety of different reasons. But you need to visit Europe at the moment, see what's going on in
well, I do visit quite a lot, and I have to admit I haven't noticed that. So you're suggesting that you are sympathetic to strong immigration controls?
I'm sympathetic to immigration controls that are based upon, based on control. I'm not against immigration. I'm an immigrant myself, so I'm a big fan of immigration.
I mean, yeah, you seem the perfect example. I mean, is it because you came from Hungary rather than Tunisia or Iraq?
I've got a lot of North African friends. It's not a question of I'm trying to keep North Africans out. All I'm saying is that, and at the moment, there does seem to be an inherent tendency towards conflict between societies that have large Muslim populations. Now, that might be called Islamophobic. I think that's an objective assessment of what happens when you have large groups of people that are not absorbed into that society. Now, in some societies, you can absorb anybody. But at the moment in Europe, you have a situation where you do have parallel lives.
Where do you live, Frank? Where do you live?
I live half my life in Kent and half my life in Brussels in Belgium.
I know is Brussels have the same problem you're suggesting?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not a problem. I mean, if I go to the gym, all my mates are North African, and and I've got close relationship with people from all kinds of communities. But I do know that there is two different worlds in Brussels, and that leads to a situation of potential conflict or real conflict, sort of time and time again. And that's not something that you want to ignore. That's not an argument against immigration per se. It's an argument against multiculturalism. I think that's my problem, multiculturalism. I think societies need to sign up to the same culture.
So you're suggesting, what you mean by that is that your mates in the gym, your North African mates in the gym in Brussels should be reading Kant and Shakespeare. I don't know who Shakespeare. I don't think the Belgians have a Shakespeare, but whoever the equivalent is in
Belgium. That would be great if they did that. But as it happens,
I'm not sure even the Belgians read.
Exactly. Nobody reads Shakespeare or Kant. But what I am saying is that, and a lot of them actually do sign up, is that people have got to sign up to the same values, foundational values. You can have different religious ideals on top of that, but there is got to be a certain common denominator that binds us together, no matter where we come from.
Well, maybe we should just all read the Quran. I mean, what would be so? I mean, so you're not so it's not the tradition itself; it's just having one tradition.
It's having laws and rules and values that people live by. And in the case of Brussels or Belgium, you'd assume that they would be the values that were organic to the experience of that country. So, I would imagine that you want to have a democracy and a kind of public life that reflects that to some extent.
Yeah, although Belgium's an odd case because it's never really been a country. It was formed in the 19th century out of the rump of the Netherlands, but that's another story. Finally, Frank, this is interesting stuff. You're an old revolutionary communist now. I mean, some people might think of yourself as a conservative. You get featured in papers like the Daily Mail. I mean, I take your point and you're quite nuanced in your own way, but you know as well as I do that your arguments and these types of arguments get taken up by very conservative, some people might say reactionary newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Orban camp in Hungary. Are you concerned that your intellectually sophisticated, credible arguments can be used by people I'm sure you don't like or respect, but nonetheless who use these sort of broadly credible intellectual arguments to essentially bash immigrants, to suggest that they need to throw out black people or Muslims? Should this be of concern to a guy like you who's spent a whole career writing many different books, and as I said, your expertise is in sociology?
No, I'm not concerned. I'm a humanist at heart, and I think that.
Well, the Daily Mail is not a humanist newspaper, is it?
Well, I mean, not everybody that publishes me, is on the same page as I am. I write for a lot of different newspapers, and speak at a lot of different TV channels, and it's for me, what's important is I get an opportunity to express my views, and the more opportunity I have to express my views, the better, and that's what's important to me. So people need to sort of judge what I write rather than anything else. And if people find that there's a problem with the words that I use or my theories or my ideals, then there's a problem that I'm happy to debate and discuss. But you have to remember that one of the problems that we have is that there is no traffic in ideas between different sections of our society.
Well, there is, Frank. I mean, haven't we trafficked in ideas? There's lots of stuff online. There are lots of good shows. People still talk about this stuff. Maybe
I think you're refreshingly naive, I think, when it comes to this, because if you look at just the tremendous ghettoization of opinion, online in particular, it is truly worrying. The same kind of people write for the same kind of publications.
Well, I'm going to put that as an advertisement for my show, Frank Furedi. Refreshingly naive. No one's ever called me naive before, but I'm taking it in a good way. I have to say that I'm the only, and you and I were talking about this before we went live, the only one group of people who I don't like are Romanian defenders. Could we agree on that? That Romanian defenders should not be allowed into North London?
Or we should have immigration controls against.
We should have immigration controls in the United Kingdom against any kind of Romanian defender, especially if they end up at Tottenham Hotspur. Frank Furedi, great honor. You are a humanist, a man very willing to bring out controversial ideas and argue them in public. Honor to have you on the show, and we have to end, Frank. Come on, you Spurs.
You those. Talk to you later. Take care.
On the scene, he's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering